Okay. Welcome to a meeting that Big Money Out Virginia has set up, and we're honored to have the Brennan Center's legal counsel, Eric Petry, come and talk about the different models of public financing. And that's an important area of our reforms we've been trying to do in Virginia. And we welcome any questions. Please put them in the chat. Our two speakers are, of course, Mr. Petry and then Nancy Morgan, who is our fountain of information about all our work and leads our activities in getting campaign finance reforms in Virginia. She'll also talk about what we're working for with American Promise and at the federal level as well. Nancy, would you like to introduce the speaker?
Yeah. Well, why don't I provide a brief context of what we're looking at in terms of campaign finance reform in Virginia. And Eric, thanks so much. We're really appreciative of the Brennan Center for Justice. You along with the Campaign Legal Center, I think, have been the two institutions that really support state level work on campaign finance reform. So I noticed Patrick Llewellyn, who just came in, and he's with the Campaign Legal Center. I'm just doing a shout out for all these great organizations that help us on the state level work on campaign finance and good governance. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit. I mentioned, or Karen mentioned, that we basically, our group started about 7 years ago because looking at a constitutional amendment to the U.S. in order to allow Congress and the states to regulate election spending. And then about 5 years ago, a friend of ours said, well, why don't we look at Virginia legislation? And we all looked confused and look around because we didn't know anything about Virginia legislation. And so lo and behold, it's pretty egregious that when you look at the status of Virginia, and this is the Coalition for Integrity's swamp index that they did in 2020. Basically, we ranked 46 out of 50 jurisdictions in terms of on the swamp index, which measures basically accountability and transparencies to voters. And you can see on the side when you go down, you have Virginia, and then you have Utah, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. So this was basically because when you look at Virginia, we have no limits on campaign contributions. There are no limits on personal use of campaign donations, which means that I, as a candidate, you can give me $1 million and I can just take a bunch of lobbyists down to the Caribbean. So there's just no, and people are really shocked when they hear about this. There's limited disclosure. There's certainly a lack of effective oversight in the Department of Elections. And also when you look at the broader issue with ethics reform, we did ethics reform after the McDonald's scandal in 2015, but basically we've been doing FOIA analysis and stuff like that, and it just goes to show that our systems for ensuring oversight on ethics and campaign finance are pretty bad. So when you look at it, as I said, it results in people having less than not a lot of confidence in their institutions or their elected officials, and this mirrors what is happening nationally. We did some polling with the Brennan Center, and we found out 78% of Virginians, irrespective of party, feel that big donors have too much influence in our election process. They feel that 88% of people think that we need to have total transparency in terms of elections and disclosure. So there really is nationally and Virginia, there's this overwhelming support for campaign finance. I think when you look nationally, you're looking all the money going into our national elections. Open Secrets really does a good job of tracking that. In 2020, it was over $16 billion, with a lot of money coming from independent expenditures. That part of money that basically includes dark money that is undisclosed to the voters. But when you look at Virginia, basically this isn't about Citizens United. This is the fact that we have no regulations. And when you look, I think you can see the same exponential trend when you look on the national national amount of money come into our elections. If Open Secrets had 2020 in 2022 had $16 billion, I expect when you're looking at the money coming into this election between the congressional races and the presidential race, I'll bet you $10 it will be like 22 billion. Okay, let's just see. I only have 22, you know, so I only have $10 to put into a poll. But when you look at Virginia, it's like that. It's exponential. In the last 2023, this was both the Senate and the House. It was $183 million, and in 2021, that was also when we had a gubernatorial race. Again, that hit record levels. It's sort of this, looking at data, it's hard to put it in a context, but I use Open Secrets data, and I compared basically the amount of money going into Illinois, Texas, California, and when you compare it basically on a per capita estimate, because we have 8.7 million citizens, whereas in New York, I mean, Eric, you can probably correct this, but it's probably like 33 million people or something. But you look at it's the highest per capita in the country at $22 per citizen. Over the years, over the last 5 years, we've been instrumental in working with legislators who have introduced really pretty good bills, restricting personal use of campaign donations. That's been introduced 14 years in a row. Campaign finance limits, disclosure of dark money advertising. There was a pretty good bill last year that was introduced. Investment in an information portal on campaign finance filings and Department of Election. That's a new bill that we've got some champions for. On the disclosure of dark money advertising, thanks to the Campaign Legal Center in Arizona, we're hopefully getting a Republican who might be drafting a bill that's similar to the Arizona law, where they have disclosure of dark money advertising and including traceback into where the money comes into the system and then is redistributed. And ethics reform, obviously, that's an important issue that we're talking to legislators. And public financing of elections. Obviously, this is a really important issue, and that's why we have Eric here. Last year, we had Aaron McKean from the Campaign Legal Center. We're really hoping to get a better idea of how to introduce a bill. And in fact, this bill was introduced, and it was very useful to have the Campaign Legal Center and the Brennan Center for Justice get guidance from them on best practices, because this bill was actually based on the New York State progressive match system, which this is a lot of information, but it's basically it's getting a progressive match on smaller donor contributions of less than $250. It's restricted to your district, and the match goes down as the money goes up, and they can only get the money if they're in competitive races, and they have to have a certain number of qualified small donor contributions. And then there are caps. Well, then the question come in, is it possible to put in a small, a matching public financing of elections system in a state that has no caps in general? So the interesting thing about this one, and this one was surprising to us, because funding of these programs is always a little bit controversial, but funding in this case, what he did, and we didn't know this until we saw the final draft of the bill, is an optional contribution of $40 from an individual filer or $80 for a joint filer. It's like the $3 check that you do on your, federal taxes if you want to support the presidential public financing program, which I don't even think is operational anymore. Anyway, it was a great bill. It got through the Public Privileges and Elections Committee, which is the bill that looks at elections bills that campaign finance, ranked choice voting, and it died in appropriations. But there was an interesting discussion around it. To put this in a context, this year in Virginia, we have a short legislative system because it's not a budget year, and this obviously requires a budget, significant budget. So this is a question. That's why we're grateful that Eric is here, just to give us some guidance on hopefully he'll give us a view of looking at the different types of programs, the benefits of the program, and basically how can you fund these programs. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Petry, who is he's with the Brennan Center for Justice, we have in common that he has his BA in economics. I've got my master's in economics, but he went on to something bigger and better than I did because he actually earned a JD with honors from the University of Chicago Law School, where he was the executive director of the Law School Review. And now he works at the Brennan Center, and he basically does research and develops policy solutions to address the issue of money in politics and promote election security. So Eric, I'm just going to turn it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Nancy, and thank you all for having me today. Some of this you may already know, but I'm just going to go through kind of an overview of the different types of public financing models, the benefits of public funding, kind of a quick look at which states and localities have implemented these systems, a little bit of a deeper dive into the New York State model, and as Nancy said, talking about some of the different ways to fund these programs. So at a very high level, public financing comes in different shapes and sizes. One of the most popular is small donor match systems. And even within that, there are different flavors, different styles. So there's single match, where $1 of a small contribution is matched with $1 of public funds. Multiple matches, which is the 6-to-1 that you see in, for example, for the Freedom to Vote Act. And then there are tiered or progressive match systems like what's been introduced in Virginia, the New York State model, which increases the amount of public funding for smaller amounts of contributions. So typically it's, under $50 are matched at the highest rate, then the next $100 are matched at a lower rate, and so forth. So setting aside the small donor match programs, other types of public funding include block grant systems. For example, Arizona state, a few other states and localities have block grants where once a candidate qualifies, they raise a certain number of dollars from small donors, they're entitled to just a lump sum of money from the state to fund their campaign. And then another system are vouchers, they're often called democracy vouchers. The Freedom to Vote Act also includes this, where essentially voters are given $50 or $100, some amount that they can distribute their voucher to campaigns, and campaigns can turn that into cash to run their campaign. The benefits of public funding, and I think I probably don't have to convince any of you on why this is important, but it's crucial, I think, for democracy to amplify the voices of small donors to counteract the influence of big money in politics. And with a lot of the small donor matching systems that we're seeing now, the requirement of raising money in district can really boost the connection between candidates and constituents and their communities, right? In the New York system, for instance, and the Virginia model as well, the small donor contributions are only eligible for matching if they come from within the candidate's district. And the Brennan Center has advocated, I believe that there are real democracy benefits to that, right? To actually ground elections in the jurisdiction, in the districts where the constituents live. Beyond that, public funding systems provide more opportunities for more candidates. That's women, people of color, candidates from the LGBTQ community, any community where they've been historically underrepresented in politics. Public funding has had a real tangible benefit. We've seen that in the New York City elections, in the Washington, D.C. elections, and some county elections in Maryland. So I think these things have real, crucial, tangible benefits on who runs, who has access to public office, and also the types of folks who contribute. Research from across the country shows that small donor public financing systems promote civic engagement. It It encourages new and more diverse donors, people who previously were not involved in the political system or had never donated before get involved. It sort of counteracts the narrative of, my voice doesn't matter, my dollars don't matter, when you can turn a $10 donation into $70, or in the New York system, you can turn a $250 donation into $2,300, right? It's just boosts the voice, gets more people involved, gets civic engagement up, which all these things are a democratic good. Looking at the jurisdictions with public financing systems, currently there are 14 states in the country that have some form of public financing and 26 localities. And these programs vary a lot in terms of when they came into existence. Some of the earliest were in the 1970s. More recently, localities as recently as 2023 have passed new systems. New York's system came into effect, or was passed in 2020, and this will be the first election where it's in effect across the state. So there's real momentum. Some of these systems have been implemented recently, and I think it's great that this group exists, that these conversations are happening to try to expand these systems into new jurisdictions. So obviously the Brennan Center was intimately involved in the New York State model. It's something that we really believe in. We think is a good model that a lot of jurisdictions can implement. We think it's transportable and yeah, has a lot of benefits. So obviously, the New York system, as well as all public financing systems, have to be a voluntary opt-in. Constitutionally, the Supreme Court has said that the government can't force candidates to run or opt into public financing systems under the First Amendment freedom of speech. So that's sort of a prerequisite. But one thing that's interesting about the New York system that hasn't been implemented everywhere else is that candidates can continue to raise unmatched contributions if they exhaust the maximum amount of public financing. And that's important. It maybe is a little counterintuitive if we start with the premise that big money in politics is a problem. It may be counterintuitive to think that New York system letting candidates continue to raise big contributions it may be counterintuitive to think that that's a good thing, but we think that it has the benefit of encouraging candidates to participate in the system, right? That's one of the criticisms or concerns about public financing is you have to make the system attractive to candidates such that they're actually willing to participate because it's a voluntary opt-in system. And so New York system, we think does that by allowing candidates to continue to raise money. As I said earlier, New York system is a progressive or tiered in-district match. So it's actually more, it matches at a higher rate than the Virginia bill would have. It matches at the same level of contribution, so donations between $5 and $250, but the first $50 in New York are matched at 12 to 1. The next 100 are matched at 9 to 1. And the final 100 are matched at 8 to 1, which these are some of the most generous matches that exist in current law. And like I said earlier, it can turn a $250 donation into more than $2,000 for campaigns. The eligibility thresholds, all systems set eligibility thresholds, and that'll vary, I think, by locality or by state. Kind of have to look at what the demographics are, what the earning power or donating power is in a particular jurisdiction. But something that's interesting about New York and an important feature is that in districts where the median average income is below the statewide average, the eligibility thresholds are reduced by 1/3. And that was in response to candidates from lower income districts who were concerned that they would have a hard time raising funds and being competitive and meeting those thresholds. So the New York system takes account of the different fundraising capacity in different parts of the state. New York also has some cost control measures. Most public financing systems have maximum match amounts, so they cap the amount of public funds that are available to candidates. But one thing that I think was an innovation in New York and has been reflected in Virginia as well is that funds are limited for unopposed candidates, right? If a candidate runs unopposed, they're not eligible to receive public financing funds unless, and this is an important exception, unless there's a contested primary for the opposing major party. So if in New York, say one candidate is running unopposed, but their opponent or the opposing party has a contested primary, then the candidate running unopposed can raise up to 50% of the cap for the primary in anticipation of sort of building up the war chest or the funds to run a competitive general election. New York also tries to control costs by limiting funds available for small primaries. So for any district where or any election where there's fewer than 1,000 eligible voters, the maximum amount of public financing funds available is only $5,000. There's also limitations on uncompetitive races. So the New York Public Campaign Finance Board has authority under New York statute to promulgate rules determining what counts as a competitive election. And if there's no competitive opponent in a particular race, then that candidate is only eligible to receive 25% of the maximum public financing amount. Administration, obviously, an important part of these systems. Who's going to administer the system, who's going to oversee eligibility. And in the New York system, that's, again, the New York Public Campaign Finance Board. They determine candidate eligibility. They also provide really important candidate support features. They provide trainings, they provide education, sort of to raise awareness about the public financing system, to make sure the candidates know exists and boost participation. The board also has the authority to issue rules and regulations. And importantly, they also conduct post-election audits. So for statewide candidates, they audit all participants. They also audit high-earning candidates. So that's above $500,000. Anyone who receives $500,000 or more from the public financing system is audited. And then there's a random lottery system for legislative candidates. And obviously, these are important features because when you're providing large sums of public funding to candidates, you need to ensure that it's being used appropriately, that the candidates are complying with the rules. These programs all include limitations on contribution amounts, so they cap maximum contributions to ensure that candidates are receiving money from actual small donors. So you need to make sure that there's no fraud, making sure that candidates are complying with the system. Finally, on funding, there are a number of ways of doing this. So like Virginia, New York also uses a tax checkoff system where individuals on their tax returns can elect that $40 of their tax return be directed to the public financing fund, or $80 for joint filers. But New York system is more expansive, and they also take funds from the abandoned property fund. So when the state takes over abandoned property in New York, those funds are directed to the public financing system. And New York can also receive contributions from individuals and organizations, as well as funds from the general fund in New York. Other systems, so for example, the Freedom to Vote Act at the federal level, they would fund the system entirely from fines, penalties, and settlements from corporate malfeasance, as well as gifts and bequests. So there are a number of ways to fund these programs, generally for, I think, political reasons and to ensure that there's buy-in support from the public. These systems tend to avoid using tax dollars or imposing any sort of tax obligation on citizens. But there are a number of other ways to ensure that these public financing funds are fully funded and at an adequate level to ensure that the programs are attractive enough, generous enough to get candidates to opt in. And with that, I'm happy to open the floor and take any questions that anyone might have.
Karen, is there anything in the chat?
There's nothing in the chat. Did you get any when
Hey,
you
Eric.
signed? Oh,
I'll wade in. Hey, Eric, this is Brian, Alexandria, Virginia. I'm very new to this stuff, so I'm just forgive maybe my the naivete of this question, but for the opt-in, what you just said last, how does that work exactly? I mean, I'm not quite clear how that works. If they opt in, what are they giving up? Or, you know, if they volunteer, what's the opportunity cost? If they do that, then what would they not be doing as a candidate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that can take different forms in different jurisdictions. Generally, the opt-in requires the candidate to agree to the rules set by the system. So that's generally limitations on the maximum amount that candidates can receive from any individual donor. So setting limits on their ability to fundraise from large contributions. It can also include caps on, the way that these funds can be spent, the types of activities that the campaigns can engage in. But really the big one, I think, sort of from a constitutional perspective, the big one is limiting the types of money that campaigns can raise and the amount that they can raise from donors.
Mm-hmm.
I always have questions, and this comes up because when the cost of these programs, I mean, I mentioned that this year isn't a budget year for Virginia, and we were trying to calculate, you know, how much money actually has to be in a pot to launch it. And we were trying to look at, obviously, New York State is much bigger than Virginia. You have a full-time legislature, so you have a lot more candidates. Can you talk to us about the general cost of the program? How much are they looking at it costing over a year? And how do they do the projections of the long-term costs?
Yeah, you know, I can't speak to the specifics in New York of how they project it out over time, but I can speak a little bit about the maximum contribution amounts. And I mean, it's going to be expensive for sure. Right? It's candidates for statewide office can raise, I believe it's up to $3.5 million per election. So that's $3.5 million for the primary and $3.5 million for the general. State Senate candidates can raise up to $375,000 in public financing for both primaries and generals, and assembly candidates can raise $175,000. In terms of crunching the numbers and projecting out, that is crucial, right? Because you have to both make sure that the fund itself has enough money in it to support these candidates. And you also have to make sure, as I alluded to earlier, that the maximum public benefit available to candidates is generous enough or high enough that candidates are going to opt in. Obviously, that's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from locality to states. As you said, you know, the length of time that legislators are actually in session. New York obviously has a year-long session. Many other states, Virginia included, don't. I think the Freedom to Vote Act at the federal level is an interesting approach because it actually doesn't set a maximum amount, an actual dollar amount at the maximum public benefit available to candidates. They peg it to the previous election cycle. And so they take the average of the top 20 highest spending congressional campaigns and that's the maximum amount available in the next election. So the idea there is that if you peg it to the highest spending campaigns, at least for the vast majority of congressional races, that should be sufficient funding to give candidates the ability to actually fund their campaign on public financing matching dollars. So that's an interesting innovation at the federal level. Unfortunately, I can't speak to sort of the projections. My economic days are long behind me at this point. But yeah, I mean, the decision tree there is, you've got to make sure you fund it, and you've got to make sure that it's generous enough to get people to opt in.
And then another question that came up from somebody, and this was related to something like ranked choice voting. And somebody said, well, on public financing, because it's such a new program to Virginia, we don't have limits, we restrict personal use. Maybe it's better to just start out with having a bill, and this had been introduced a couple of years ago, to allow local jurisdictions to implement it, so you build up a sort of a more community awareness of the issue. What are your views on that?
I think it could be challenging if you're doing it at the local level. That obviously limits the number of candidates who can participate, right? If Alexandria or whichever local jurisdiction wants to implement public financing, only candidates within that jurisdiction are going to be able to participate. So state legislative, congressional districts obviously extend beyond localities. I mean, I think from a proof of concept, from the point of view of like, can we actually make this work? I think public financing at the local level is great, and you can build momentum. I think public financing anywhere is a benefit to democracy. So I don't think it has to be either or, though. New York is a good example of that, right? It started in New York City. There was a public financing, a multiple match, progressive match in the city for a number of years, and then it was so popular, successful, it gained momentum and became law at the state level. So there's certainly precedent for that, but I don't think it has to be either or.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Do you collect at the center or the states sort of testimonials? Like, I ran for office and I didn't take corporate money. I signed up for public financing and I won despite, what my opponent spent.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to a lot of candidates who have won or been successful, and they attribute it to public financing. I mean, a great example of that is Letitia James in New York, the Attorney General. She's been very candid that public financing at the city level, she says she wouldn't be where she is today without the public financing. And the data, I mean, the Brennan Center has studied the New York City model and the New York State model extensively, and the data is very clear that it allows women, people of color, folks who are traditionally less represented in politics, it allows them to run more competitive campaigns. Because these folks are generally raising more money from small donors to begin with, as opposed to white male candidates. And so public financing, has a real benefit to get more people running, to get more people donating. And yeah, the testimonials, examples abound.
Brian has another question. Brian, do you just want to ask it rather than me read it?
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going back to what you had said, Eric, about the handful of states and a handful of localities that have in which public funding policy has gained some traction. And I was just wondering, I mean, thinking about how realistic it would be for let's say, Virginia to move forward in promoting the design of a policy like that. Have you noticed a kind of type of state or a type of locality that tends to be amenable or interested in this kind of approach, this kind of policy model. Whether it's blue, red, purple, or, sort of the demographics of that state or locality. I'm just curious if there is any takeaways that you found from the kinds of states that are moving forward with this policy or have been implementing this policy for some time now.
Sure. So one resource, I'll actually drop this in the chat, is the Brennan Center's Guide to Public Financing Programs. So I just dropped that link in the chat. That's a great resource and catalogs the states and localities that have implemented these systems. So I'd encourage you to take a look there. I mean, I think, as Nancy said, right, there's widespread agreement across voters, across really any way you slice it. There's widespread agreement that campaign financing reform is a good thing, that there's too much money in politics, and that we should, there's a better way to do this. And so I think there is a lot of momentum. Places like certain counties in Maryland, Evanston, Illinois, Washington, D.C., New York have passed public financing systems within the past 5 years. It's not isolated examples here or there. It's across the country at both the state and local level. So I think, there's widespread support for this, and there's momentum. And hopefully, as these systems get implemented and get stood up, like Karen's question earlier, there are so many testimonials of the benefits of these programs. The data is very clear on that. So as there's more, more evidence of why these systems are beneficial, hopefully that just keeps the momentum rolling.
And before going to Diane's question, I just want to ask, and if this is a follow-up to Brian's question, because when you look at, Maryland has Montgomery County, Howard County, a bunch of counties that have public financing. They have public financing for the governor in Maryland. But most of the places where they implement it are blue. And when Marcus Simon introduced his bill, it was interesting because he did get Republicans who were interested in it. Todd Gilbert, who is he's the Republican head of the Republican caucus in the House, said, "Well, what happens if there isn't enough money in it?" So there was good questions, but at the end of the day, will you have states examples where Republican legislators, general assemblies have passed public financing? What is the dialogue from that side?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean,
I'm just because this seems to be introduced in a lot of blue areas. Seattle, the democracy voucher, Portland, and stuff like that. But the question is, what do the Republicans say about it? Are there areas, jurisdictions where actually Republican-dominated legislators have enacted this? What is their opposition to it? What are they saying?
Well, I haven't personally been involved in those conversations, but I think generally the opposition to these programs are that they're too expensive, right? That's the common refrain, is that it's too expensive. To Diane's question, where's the money going to come from? That's a concern. And some opposition is, I think, just rooted in a disagreement over whether there's, whether this is the way to solve this problem. The question of big money in politics is so big that can public financing really make a difference? Again, I think the data shows that it really does, that by amplifying small contributions at a tiered or progressive match, it can make a real difference, especially in state races, but I think also in federal elections as well. And to the question of funding, again, there are examples of this working. The New York system has been funded. It's attractive enough to get candidates to participate. And I think as there are more examples of this working successfully, that opposition sort of dissolves, right? It's hard to stand in the face of experience and boots on the ground evidence and maintain those arguments.
Oh, okay, thank you. And then Diane brought up again the issue, and I think this is always a difficult, where does the public financing, when it comes from the general fund, you mentioned different states take the money from different places. Where does the money from the general fund typically comes from taxpayer dollars, right? So.
Yeah, so I think what a lot of these systems do is they prohibit new tax levies from being implemented to fund the program. But yeah, if the money's coming from a general fund or other public funds where the original donor or the origin of that money is tax dollars, ultimately those are taxpayer funds. The federal bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, is not in that model, though. It strictly prohibits any taxpayer funds from being used for the public financing program. It's all from fines, penalties, and settlements on corporate wrongdoing.
Karen.
I have another question. Even though this cuts down on the money spent, there's still the problem of the 501c4s and the messaging still being able to skyrocket. Has anybody tied the two issues together, or that's just a separate piece of legislation?
I think that's a separate piece. Outside spending under current Supreme Court doctrine, outside spending is independent of campaigns, and there's under the law, there's not allowed to be any coordination between campaigns and outside spending groups, right? There are legitimate questions as to how robust anti-coordination rules are enforced. There are questions about whether the extent of campaigns are actually coordinating with outside spending groups, but I think unfortunately, public financing systems, it's difficult to think of a way to get at the outside spending problem with public funding. I think the theory with public financing is, at least you're getting candidates to rely on small donors, preferably donors within their districts. And because they're relying on those donors, tying themselves to their communities and their future constituents, they're able to run competitive campaigns, and that at least gets the problem of large individual donors out of politics. But the outside spending problem, I think, is separate and requires separate solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's why after 4 or 5 years looking at this, we recognize that when you want to do comprehensive campaign finance reform, you have to do incrementally. So you can look at the low-hanging fruit, like restrictions on personal use or improving an information portal, maybe limits. There's a lot of, and just for the audience's education, last year there was a good bill, and it was written, and the two big donors in Virginia are Dominion Energy and Clean Virginia. They agreed that we need to have a moratorium on our money arms race, and then at the end, it came down to, they said, well, we'll support this if leadership supports it. So the issue was, and we had Democratic leadership in the House, and we were a little bit disappointed that the bill wasn't even introduced or heard. So it's interesting that how difficult it is. I think public financing is perhaps less opposition to it, because even Republicans in lower income districts recognize they can benefit. I don't know whether any of the states or jurisdictions that you talk about, if you don't have limits, can you have an effective system of public financing, even though you impose limits to the people who take the public financing? Is there any? Well, we're one of only 5 states that has no limits. So We would love to get limits, but the argument about limits goes back to the chicken and the egg. If you pull those limits, money is fungible and it goes back through independent expenditures, outside spending. So it's a complicated issue, but we would love to, I think, we would love to get this bill introduced. It's a good messaging bill. People have a conversation about it. But maybe if we could get one that allows local jurisdictions to introduce it, that might be good also. So and anyway, I think campaign finance is so complicated that you need a multi-year strategy.
Well, speaking of the complications, some of these plans do, especially New York sounds complex, and I'm sure even Maryland is complex. How do they kind of market it or inform people? I'm wondering if they take it to the groups like Run for Something that help try to get people that don't normally run for office to run and do more training, and these groups could lobby for this type of public financing too.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a grassroots element to it, that there are organizations going into districts, informing potential candidates that these funds exist, and developing excitement, building momentum for folks to participate. That's certainly an element of it. But also the public financing board in New York has a mandate to conduct trainings and to promote awareness about the program as well. So I think multi-pronged, but there are a lot of ways to get the word out, and already, in the New York City elections and New York State, it's having a real impact.
Any other questions? One question, and this was, I heard from somebody in Michigan, we have the checkoff, the $3 checkoff, presidential checkoff on our tax forms. And we heard there was some news that basically that money, $300 million or $400 million, had been taken and was going to be given to other sources. The Defense Department, Secret Service, there were a couple articles on how that money isn't available for people running for president anymore. Do you know anything about that?
That's not something that I've looked into deeply, but now I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of filing a lawsuit saying the federal government is stealing my money because I've been checking that $3. But anyway, thank you very much. We appreciate, certainly all the technical support from the Brennan Center. And also the Campaign Legal Center, because they really provide a lot of guidance to us on how to, the bills that are presented. But we're hoping that something will happen in Virginia, and and maybe within the next 3 years we'll get public financing. So thank you very much, Eric, and thank everybody else. Oh, just to let you know, I did put in the chat, we do have this action alert, which is saying send an email to your legislator. It will go to your Virginia senator, delegate, the congressional representative, saying please support campaign finance. And we're also having a Democracy Day on January 15th, and thanks to the Clean Virginia, who has given us a small grant. I put a link in there for anybody who wants to join us, and that's next year, and doing advocacy on good governance, ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform. Thanks so much, and thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Eric.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Nancy.
Bye. Thanks, Karen.